Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. So, the turkey has all been gobbled, and my favorite day of the year, Halloween, has long since passed, putting us squarely in the month of December, which is not only the last month of the year, that is if you subscribe to the whole Gregorian calendar thing, but it's also the most terrifying. That's right, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold. Forget about the haunted houses and the spooky movies. This holiday season, people may in fact refer to it as a holiday season, instead of strictly and vehemently only referencing Christmas. Oh, the horror. The horror. Now, I've talked before about my love of all things Halloween. I don't think that it's a particularly niche position, and certainly not amongst horror fans, of which I do consider myself. But that being said, I am far from being an old bah humbug. I mean, first of all, I do have kids. 3 of them, in fact. And oh my God, do I adore watching them open presents in pajamas on a wintry Christmas morn. Also, hot chocolate just hits different in the month of December. Same goes for peppermint, not to mention the lights. Look, I'm not just so cold-hearted and cynical that I can look out at all the gorgeous displays, especially when they're out in force, and not feel a little bit of that good old-fashioned, fabled Christmas cheer of old. Is it, in fact, the most wonderful time of the year, as the song proclaims? Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it's certainly not bad, all things considered. Now, obviously, Christmas has a long, complicated, complex, and convoluted history. Probably other words that start with C too, that touches on everything from pagans to Coca-Cola. And as interesting as all that is, that's just not what this episode is about. Though that information is readily available if you want to go look it up. But regardless of where it came from, this weird concoction of a holiday that throws its weight around for the whole of December, and honestly a good portion of November, has become an undeniable part of the winter/end-of-year experience. A cultural historical convention not only here in my home of America, but indeed in many places across the entire world. So I can't really count it as shocking that there are some folk, well, who take the holiday a little bit too seriously. For these folks, you don't want to mess with their Starbucks cups or their Donners or their Blitzens. Also, just a quick side note, Blitzen is a stupid name. And if you remember correctly, one of Santa's reindeer is named Cupid. And we as a society just kind of don't talk about that. But nonetheless, these are the aforementioned haters of the inclusive term Happy Holidays. And you certainly don't want to mess with that infamous big jolly man in the red suit. That's right, Father Christmas, Saint Nick, Kris Kringle, or the name we all know and love him by the best, Santa Claus. And I can think of no better time to bring in this episode's trigger warnings. But first, may I politely remind you that the Band Media Podcast Patreon is up and running. Sign up and take a look behind the scenes at the inner workings of the show. Also, take part in our monthly suggestion box. But most importantly, help keep this little podcast that could up and running and coming out on a regular schedule. This week, we will be discussing childhood trauma and child abuse, sexual assault, mental instability, and for those of you listening with young children, first of all, why? But second of all, we will also be talking about, let's say, true facts about the existence of old Saint Nick, if you catch my drift. There's an old saying I'm sure you're all familiar with. Don't judge a book by its cover. It's a mostly accurate idea that lives on much to the chagrin of cover art illustrators everywhere. Well, This episode's offering is kind of a weird monkey's paw scenario, where the creator of the film foresaw the controversy coming and prepared for it. But it was the controversy of its metaphorical cover, in this case its advertising, that brought in the real shitstorm. And may I remind you that shitstorm is in fact a scientifically and mathematically accurate unit of measurement for controversy. The film in question is none other than the 1984 cult classic, Silent Night, Deadly Night. The film centers around Billy, a young man who goes insane and proceeds to go on a Christmas Eve killing spree through his small town, punishing those who have been naughty. That's the elevator pitch anyway. The whole story is a little bit more. So I'm going to lay out some of the important bits, keeping it as spoiler-free as possible, but it should also be noted that this is not really a big twist and turns movie. Young Billy is taken to see his invalid grandfather for a quick Christmas visit at the old folks' home. As a quick note, I understand that these are outdated terms, but given the nature of the film, it's kind of the best we have to go on. Grandpa hasn't said a word for ages, but when Billy is left alone with Grandpa, while Mom and Dad and Baby talk to the staff for a moment, out of nowhere, Grandpa gets a crazed look in his eye and tells Billy that Santa doesn't only give presents to good kids, but that he also punishes the bad ones. Grandpa goes back to invalid mode before the fam bam comes back, and they head off to hopefully more festive Christmas traditions. Sadly, young Billy is about to have a streak of Santa-themed bad luck. The family comes across a man in a Santa suit broke down on the side of the road. Little do they know that this Santa had just murdered an innocent gas station merchant for what turned out to be a grand total of $31, though that is $31 in 1984 money. Despite Billy's protests, the family pulls over to help the man, quickly earning Dad a bullet in the head. Billy darts to some shrubs on the side of the road to hide, then bears witness to his mother being first sexually assaulted and then having her throat slit. Cut to 4 years later, Billy and his brother Ricky are now wards of a Catholic orphanage. It is here we are introduced to the real killer of the movie, 8-year-old Billy's killer mullet. The orphanage is run by Mother Superior, a strict disciplinarian who says things like, quote, "I see nothing but greed," end quote, as she watches children, orphans no less, some of the most vulnerable among us, open up Christmas presents. She also beats children for misbehavior, whether that misbehavior is real or just perceived, and believes that punishment is not only a necessary thing, but a good thing. There is a nun that goes by the name of Sister Margaret who tries to support Billy, but Mother Superior is still the boss and forces young Billy to do things like sit in Santa Claus's lap, despite being fully aware that at bare minimum, Billy believes a man in a Santa outfit killed his family. Look, I think you get the point. It's not a great place to be. Cut to 10 years later, and Sister Margaret is talking to the owner of a local toy store, trying to get a job for a child of hers that is just aged out of the orphanage. This is when we are introduced to the second real killer of the movie, Billy's killer bod. The now 18-year-old Billy has grown into quite the muscular young man and perfectly fit for the merchandise stocking job. Life seems to be good for Billy. For a bit anyway. Well, if not good, at least stable, which, not to bring the real world into this, but is something that a lot of kids that grow up in the system don't get all that often. All of this comes crashing to a halt when the man playing the store's Santa is injured and they need a new one. The store owners decide to replace him with their latest addition to the store, Stockboy, now not so little, Billy. Now, here's the point that I think is worth noting. While never done perfectly, before Billy puts on the Santa suit in the film, The movie has a surprising amount of sympathy for Billy. He is, by all definitions, a good kid who is trying to do the right thing that has horrendous obstacles placed in his path. Sadly, once the suit comes on, he snaps. The film from that point on is pretty run-of-the-mill slasher, and any sympathy towards its main character is traded in for a kind of half-assed motivation for Billy's murder spree, though it was kind of nice while it lasted. And it should be noted that this corrupt good guy trope isn't only in the domain of horror movies. Superhero movies also tend to overuse this not-so-great trope, but back when the film was building the trauma of this character, one undeniable element of that trauma was his treatment at the hands of the Catholic-run orphanage. There shouldn't be anything controversial about my next statement, but I do acknowledge that it has potential to ruffle some feathers. Nonetheless, religious institutions have a notoriously bad track record when it comes to childhood trauma, and an equally terrible, if not worse, track record of not stepping in and addressing the huge problem in their midst. Catholics, by far, are not the only ones, by the way, but they are certainly the ones who have been pushed farthest into the public light. The fact is, the church, regardless of which church the is the-ing about, is not an entity you want to find yourself up against when promoting your new film. This is something that the film's distributor, TriStar Pictures, knew all too well. Fun fact, the 3 stars that make up the Tri in TriStar are the 3 companies who originally created TriStar Pictures. That is CBS, Columbia Pictures, and HBO. So TriStar made the decision to try and avoid the wrath of the Catholics, which, by the way, totally underrated Indiana Jones movie, by releasing the film in a limited release in the Midwest, a demographic that was majority Protestant. After that, they would slowly move into a more heavily Catholic Northeast. Though it should be noted that the film was released on November 9th, 1984, at the start of what some folks consider the Christmas season, while some think the smarter move would have been to release it during the Halloween season. By and large, by the way, this tactic worked. Of all the blowback the film received, little to none of it was from the Catholic Church concerning their portrayal in the film. But what they didn't see coming was the absolute outrage that would come from their TV ads and poster. To be fair to them, though, it wasn't like there wasn't reason to think they could get away with making a Santa killer movie without stirring up this much rage. First of all, Christmas horror movies, and indeed even Christmas slasher movies, had already been around. In fact, Black Christmas, a film considered to be one of the prototypes for slasher movies, had been released 4 years earlier. Fun fact, Black Christmas was directed by Bob Clark, who about a decade later would go on to direct the absolute classic holiday film, A Christmas Story. Now, granted, Black Christmas didn't go and fuck with old Saint Nick, but Silent Night, Deadly Night wasn't the first film to do that either. 1980's Christmas Evil has a very similar premise of a man who had some Santa-related trauma as a child who grows up to dress up as Santa and go on a murder spree. There was also the 1972 PG-rated Tales from the Crypt, not to be confused with the classic mostly 90s HBO TV series, though they were based on the same comic series. Anyway, point being, the English Tales from the Crypt had a story called And All Through the Night, which features a homicidal maniac attacking a home dressed as, you guessed it, Godzilla. Okay, you caught me. I was just being silly. It was, of course, Santa Claus. So, with all these other killer clauses, TriStar thought they were pretty in the clear. They were incorrect. Not only that, they were completely unprepared because they had been preparing for the aforementioned Catholics. Firstly, there was the poster art. A beautiful rooftop covered in a thick layer of holiday snow, the top of a chimney also rimmed with snow, and an arm in a very familiar red jacket, reaching out of it, holding a double-sided axe. The TV ads that ran also featured the classic red suit and the man inside of it, arming himself up for a night of quiet dismemberment. A silent night, deadly night, if you will. Now, granted, the fact that the TV ads would air during family-friendly programming like Little House on the Prairie probably didn't help much. This led to enormous protests from parents, some even going so far as to claim that the children were now terrified of Santa. I'll chime in with this. That is completely reasonable if your kids saw the movie. A TV spot, though? Probably not so much. And I get it. Kids aren't cookie cutters. Like I said before, I have 3 kids, and each one of them I've had to parent differently to some extent. I will say that most kids can understand the explanation that the commercial they saw was for a movie and that movies aren't real. Also, any Gen Z or younger millennials tuning in, A, thank you for listening to this old man ramble. 2, feel free to bring this up next time someone my age or older starts talking about how sensitive your generation is. That in 1984, parents across the country came to local theaters and malls to protest a film, in many cases by singing Christmas carols, because its TV spot featured a Santa Claus suit and an axe in the same 30 seconds. I reiterate, oh, the horror. The PTA even got in on the action. That's right, the Parent Teacher Association, that PTA, making their own protest, trying to get the film pulled from theaters. And then there were the critics. Well, it certainly wasn't universally panned. The folks who weren't fans really hated the movie, like super hated it. Film critic Leonard Martin called it a, quote, worthless splatter film, end quote, and asked, quote, what's next? The Easter Bunny as a child molester, end quote, describing a movie that I would in fact 100% watch. Also, we need more Easter-themed horror flicks. Siskel and Ebert, maybe the biggest names of all time in film criticism, were also no fans of the flick. With Siskel saying, and Ebert adding, yeah, I hate slashers. Okay, fine, maybe those weren't direct quotes, but they weren't far off. Siskel said of the film, quote, but there's no question in my mind that the showing of Santa with an axe on free TV and in commercials is sick and sleazy and mean-spirited, end quote. If you're curious about which commercial he's talking about, it's the one he had just shown 10 seconds before on free TV as background to his voiceover. He went on to add, quote, so let's repeat the names of the people who did it. TriStar Pictures, owned by Columbia Pictures, CBS, and Home Box Office. Shame on you, end quote. And as we all know, after this reprimanding from the great Gene Siskel, Columbia, CBS, and especially HBO would all immediately be lost to the annals of film history, never to be heard from again. Ebert added that the producer and the director of the film, quote, I would like to hear them explain to their children and their grandchildren that it's only a movie, end quote. Though, if they want a place to start, may I humbly suggest the last 4 words of that exact Ebert quote. It's only a movie. Now, as silly as some people named me may find the particular rebuking of the film, it did amplify the anti-Silent Night, Deadly Night fervor across the nation. Eventually, it would lead to TriStar pulling the ads for the film. Though it should be noted, they didn't pull the ads until 6 days after the film began showing. Arguably a little bit of TriStar trying to eat its cake and have it too. But the film, too, was also pulled from theaters after a short run as a result of the controversy. In People magazine, producer Ira Barmack stated, quote, people have taken offense at Santa being used in a scary context. Santa is not a religious figure. He's a mythic figure. I didn't deliberately ride roughshod over that sensitivity, and I didn't anticipate the objection to it. End quote. Which, hey, maybe that was just a producer doing damage control for his film. But it matches up to what we have come to understand about the film's legacy over the years. And to this humble podcaster, at least, it sounds a hell of a lot less cynical than Siskel's take. Though it is worth mentioning that the indie producer Aquarius Films would try and re-release the film in a short theatrical run not even 6 months later in May of 1985. Very cleverly, they replaced all footage of Santa with weapons and instead focused on cashing in on the film's controversy, aka using the film's controversy to take out the controversial parts. Now, in the brief time that Silent Night, Deadly Night did spend in theaters, it was rated R. That R rating was actually hard fought for, with the filmmakers having to cut out some of the more violent and disturbing material. Though, maybe because the theatrical version had so few eyes on it, when the film was released on home video, it was released as unrated, so that it could add back in those gory details. This was way before the days of DVD, mind you, so rather than have a bonus section at the end of the film with said cutscenes, they just added them right back into the movie. However, the offending clips were cut from the original negatives of the movie. That means the subsequent unrated versions of the film had to rely on a separate master copy of the original film. What all this means for you and I is that the shots that were added back into the film don't really match up quality and color-wise to the rest of the film. It's actually kind of neat when you're watching the film. You know it was cut out in real time. Not the best for media preservation, mind you, but hey, I'm the silver linings kind of guy. Luckily for us, the film found its much coveted cult following on VHS, and also later iterations of home video. It would go on to spawn sequels and a loose remake, and yes, part 2 is where we get the infamous Garbage Day meme from, which, of course, now Christmas-themed horror films are far from rare, including some truly phenomenal ones like my personal favorite, Anna and the Apocalypse. But I digress. Otherwise, you'll have me going on all night. But what I will say is that whatever holiday you are celebrating or not celebrating, I hope you have a wonderful end of the year, and I hope whatever's coming down the line for you in 2024 is fabulous. Unless you're a swear for our turf, then I hope you choke. Not like till you die or anything like that. Hell, I don't even want you to go to the hospital, but maybe just enough to let you gain some perspective on why you feel like being so cruel to some of the most vulnerable among us. Happy holidays, and I hope you have an amazing new year, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold. And let me leave you with this final fun fact of 2023. I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. We got a Patreon now, so if you want to directly support the show, please go check it out over at patreon.com/bandmediapodcast. Also, feel free to find us on all the socials, but TikTok is where I'm most active, at BandRonnie. Please like, comment, and share, but if you really want to help the podcast out, tell your friends about us. That way, we can all be friends. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.